focus on those mental skills, but students being students, and they're not a lot different to primary students in many respects. They will always look for the easy option, and the easy option is press the button, hit the enter, and take whatever comes out of it. And that is a concern, and it's something that in terms of one of my interests is seeing a wide-ranging inquiry into really how we're doing training and trying to modernise our training, but in doing that, not lose some of the inherent skills that we need.
So do you think it necessarily follows that if you are a pilot and you fit the compliance requirements, that you necessarily follows that you're flying safe? Because we've received evidence to the contrary.
And I'm not surprised. If you did nothing other than what's required by the regulation and the civil aviation orders and related matters, you're a pilot. Would I let my wife and kids go flying with you? Probably not, because there is more to it. You need to have a reasonable depth of understanding, and the reality is that if you do nothing other than follow the basic theory requirements, for example, that CASA lays down, and they're quite reasonable, they don't go far enough. And the basic training requirements are good, but there are other things that you can do. There's no requirement in getting a commercial licence that you need to actually do spin training. Now, you don't have to be spin competent, but you should, in reality at least, have an understanding of how to recover from the spin and to have done it. And so, if you do nothing other than follow the regs, you have a level of competency, but it's not necessarily the level of competency that we're really looking for.
I can't remember that myself, whether it's hard, opposite, aileron and power. I think I've failed that now. Senator O'Brien.
No.
Senator Still, Senator Xenophon.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Phillips, thank you for giving evidence to this inquiry, and you're highly regarded by your peers, and I guess I'm interested in hearing from you as to a strategic overview about the whole issue of flight training. And I guess my first question would be, is the current flight training system adequate for the industry? Does it produce the pilots with the qualifications required to fly as safely as possible?
Yes and no. Yes, it does if it's run by an organisation that's approaching training in a structured fashion, and they're looking at not training for tomorrow but training for the future. So they're looking to future skill their individuals. They're looking at getting them, I suppose the easiest way to classify it is, my aim was always to graduate a thinking pilot, not an acting pilot. And within the system today, yes, we do it, but we could do it a lot better, and we could do it a lot better with some restructuring of the framework in which training sits.
Okay, so what sort of restructuring, and can you comment about some of the concerns that have been expressed to this committee about the pay for training schemes? And further to that, one of the training schools made a point that that was Oxford. They made a point that if someone isn't up to scratch or wants to get out, there is no pressure on them to pass them, in the sense that they will give their money back. If they don't think the person's up to scratch, they will simply give them a money back guarantee, and that's that. They don't want to have to deal with it. I think it's a fair summary of what Oxford's views was. How do you deal with the pay for training model and managing the risk that is inherent in that?
That really is that's the loaded dog in the room, isn't it? Because the realities are, if someone fronts up with the money, a lot of organisations are going to be very hard pressed to turn them away, and part of that is just the whole pressure of the industry, and part of that does come back to the framework. Training organisations will not provide in the main, more than they have to. Primarily because the average student fronting up isn't going to pay for anything that isn't required, unless you can, as an organisation, show them very, very clearly that by doing a little bit extra, doing more time in a simulator or going out and doing 10 hours of unusual attitude recovery is going to make them a safer and therefore a better pilot and a better prospect for a future employer. They're not interested. They don't need it to get their licence. And there's some of the aspects that impinge on this whole pay for training question. Oxford's approach has always been a little bit different to everybody else's, and part of that is their selection process. One of the issues...
That point was made in evidence. They seem to have a more rigorous selection process.
Well, they have a selection process. Most flying training schools, unless they're training for an airline specifically as airline cadets, have very little in the way of a selection process. Right. Again, because it costs and there is no real benefit to the organisation in many respects to do that. It's a lot not a lot easier, but it is easier from personal experience to take the view that you get someone to a point and all the indicators are that as long as they continue to breathe, they're not going to be able to fly the aeroplane competently. You've got to have the intestinal fortitude to sit them down and say, look, sorry, we're not continuing with you. Thank you very much. Here's the bulk of or the rest of your money back. Go away.
Are you of the view that there are some pilots who are qualifying through some of these colleges where you have concerns about their aptitude and skills as pilots?
I think at the end of the day, well, I believe that at the end of the day, no school is going to graduate someone that they really believe is unsafe. They'll graduate people who they're not overly comfortable with. My view was always you looked at the individual and as I said earlier in my piece, mine was always, would I let my wife and kids fly with them? And if the answer to that's no, then really you shouldn't be graduating them. You can equivocate around that, obviously, but if it's a clear no, then you don't do it. But it's a very, very hard. If you're looking at small flying training organisations where their margin is measured in sort of 0.5 or 0.7% or thereabouts, it's very hard to step away from that.
Can you, in terms of practical recommendations that this committee can make to improve pilot training in this country, do you think it would be reasonable for CASA to mandate a selection process, for instance, for flight training schools, to have some rigour in relation to that, similar to what Oxford and maybe others are doing? And secondly, should there be some type of money-back guarantee given, which in itself would mean that the training schools would be more careful who they select in the first place?
Okay. Yes, but there's a proviso on that. And it's not a bad way to go to push the industry towards selection. A quick anecdote, I lectured for some years at Edith Cowan University in Perth, and we had a visit from some of the psych lecturers from one of the other campuses who were absolutely appalled to find that there is no psych testing of pilot trainees unless they go through a selection process. We test everything else, whether their heart and their lungs and all the other bits and pieces work, but we don't actually test whether their head actually works properly.
So would you say no psych testing, did you say?
No psych testing, psychological testing.
Right, sorry.
Psych testing, you've got to be able to see the panel.
Yeah, right.
You wouldn't have many senators, by the way, if we put us through.
But we're not relying on you to get us from Perth to Sydney at 30,000 feet.
And that's a good thing, Mr. Phillips.
Quite possibly.
Yes.
But if I can just sort of follow that bit through, if you go to... and as I say, I believe that the idea of putting a requirement for a selection process in place is good. We'd have to look at a two-tier flying training environment. The lower tier being one that is a lot of the little flying schools and flying clubs around the country who really are only teaching people how to become recreational or private pilots. and they have the occasional person who goes on and gets a commercial. That's one group, and they really don't need selection. Then the other group, which is where Oxford and Flight Training Adelaide and many of the other bigger flying schools sit, where people are doing what's loosely referred to now as the approved or integrated CPL. There you're looking at organisations that are training people who are in there to get their commercial licence, get their command instrument rating, and they have their eyes set on the left-hand seat of a big aircraft. And in that instance, then yes, we should be doing selection training, but you need to put in place the regulatory framework that supports those flying training organisations. And part of that may well be some form of underwriting, because if you get the selection wrong, then it's going to be a fairly bold school, an Oxford, for example, that is going to be able to underwrite it completely on their own.
Sure. Now I've got several more questions to ask you, and I understand that some of my colleagues have questions as well and got limited time. But can I? You worked with CASA, is that right?
Yes.
What role did you have with CASA and when?
Was there from 2003 till the middle of 2007, and I worked in flight crew licensing standards initially, and then under Bruce Byron it changed somewhat, but essentially I was involved in the development of the regulatory parts for flight training operators, flight crew licensing, fatigue risk management and multi-crew pilot licence.
Now, can I just ask you, is the flying training industry able to invest in the technologies needed to support training for modern airliners, and should HECS be extended to ATPL trainings for airline transport pilot licence training without connection to a university?
You're aiming to get me shot.
No.
Yes, and again, it's one of those yeses and nos because.
Who would shoot you, Mr. Phillips?
Quite a few of my university colleagues. They'd be ex-colleagues, I think, if I answer this the wrong way.
We're talking philosophically here, not physically.
Look, take the first part first. Any flying training organisation that wants to get truly involved in airline pilot training has got to be in a position to invest in the technology, because if you can't do that, you can't deliver the training. The saving grace there is that today you can buy or lease simulators that are perhaps not at the top end of the market, but they're very close to it, and they're not going to cost you 7 digits. You can buy very reasonable, fully functional flight simulators for $700,000 or $800,000. On the HECS and fee help side of it, yes, there should be a broadening of that. It shouldn't be just tied to universities. There's a lot of misconceptions about how universities actually conduct flying training and how they do the academic training to it, having read through some of the submissions that you've received. But by and large, it does need to be a broader pool. As a number of submissions have made the point, we're one of the few professions where the individual carries the whole can for their training and professional qualifications, and then rolls out the end of it to probably some of the lowest paid positions around the place.
So now I just want to ask you about, we still haven't seen the training legislation updates that were promised from 1996. Could you give us some background and comment in relation to that? Because I understand there were a number of reforms that were promised back in 1996. Do you have a view on those reforms and why they haven't come into place?
Well, I can tell you from personal experience that I had Part 141 flight training operators ready to go through the department to Executive Council in December 2003. And again in January and June, or February and June 2004. By and large, that process was effectively stopped by the regulator, the senior management in the regulator at the time. To put it in